They eliminated my position during the quarterly leadership meeting. I told my sister later that night, still staring at the cardboard box sitting on my kitchen counter like it belonged to someone else's life. 19 years. And Gregory couldn't even wait until the meeting ended. But the truth is, the humiliation started before he said a single word. It started the moment I walked into conference hall B that morning and realized someone else was already sitting in my chair. Melissa Carter, 32 years old. Perfect hair. Perfect posture. Fresh executive badge clipped neatly against a cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than my first monthly mortgage payment back in 2004. She was smiling at Gregory Hale before the presentation started. Too comfortable. Too prepared. And my instincts immediately told me something was wrong. Stay with me until the end, because what happened after they publicly fired me destroyed one of the biggest consulting firms in Chicago without me lifting a finger. And tell me where you're watching from. I spent 19 years believing loyalty protected people like us. I was wrong. The conference room smelled like burnt coffee and expensive cologne. Nearly 80 employees filled the long rows of leather chairs, while the giant projector screen displayed Blackstone Strategic Solutions' Q1 expansion forecast. Everyone looked tired. That part wasn't unusual. Blackstone had been pushing aggressive growth targets for months, while quietly cutting support staff behind the scenes. Which meant senior leadership, people like me, absorbed the extra workload while Gregory collected praise during investor calls. Standard corporate behavior. I sat down slowly near the center of the executive table and opened my portfolio. Inside were 30 pages of operational forecasts I had finished at 1:40 that morning after working nearly 14 straight hours. Again, my son used to joke that Blackstone saw me more than my own family did. At the time I laughed. Now I realize he wasn't joking. Gregory stepped toward the podium exactly at 8 a.m. wearing his usual navy suit and silver cufflinks. Calm. Relaxed. The kind of confidence executives develop after years of making difficult decisions from safe distances. Before we begin quarterly projections, he announced smoothly, there's an organizational update we need to address. Something cold moved quietly through my stomach. Because Gregory never handled organizational updates personally unless legal exposure or executive optics were involved. And suddenly Melissa stopped typing. The room went completely silent. Not shocked silent. Corporate silent. The kind where everyone instinctively avoids eye contact because they already know someone's life is about to change publicly. Gregory folded his hands together. Effective immediately, Sandra Mitchell's position has been eliminated as part of our restructuring initiative. No warning. No private conversation beforehand. No dignity. Just elimination. Like I was redundant software. For a second nobody moved. I remember hearing the projector fan humming overhead, and someone shifting nervously near the back wall. One of the junior analysts looked horrified. Angela Brooks from HR stared down at her notebook like she couldn't bear to look directly at me. Melissa kept her eyes on the conference table. Interesting. People avoid eye contact when guilt enters the room. I sat perfectly still. That mattered. Because once women over 40 show emotion inside executive environments, people immediately stop describing them as strong. They start using words like unstable, difficult, emotional. I refused to give Gregory that satisfaction. Due to Blackstone's transition toward a more agile operational structure, he continued calmly, leadership responsibilities will be redistributed across multiple departments moving forward. Agile. There it was. Corporate America's favorite word for replacing older employees with cheaper ones. My fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the leather portfolio in my lap, but my expression never changed. 19 years. 19 years solving crises nobody else wanted attached to their names. I stayed overnight during system failures. Canceled vacations during mergers. Took client calls from hospital waiting rooms while my mother was dying because Gregory said the account needed stability. And now he was erasing me between quarterly projections and catered breakfast pastries. Security will assist Sandra with collecting personal belongings after the meeting, Gregory added. Security. After 19 years. The humiliation was intentional now. A warning performance for everyone else in the room. I slowly closed my portfolio. Nobody spoke. Not one person. That hurt more than losing the job itself. Because I knew these people. I protected their bonuses during budget reviews. Covered mistakes quietly so younger staff wouldn't lose promotions over one bad quarter. Remembered birthdays. Defended exhausted employees during executive meetings Gregory barely attended. And now the room sat frozen while I was publicly dismantled in front of 80 coworkers. Gregory finally looked directly at me. We appreciate your years of service. Years of service. Like I was retiring from a regional bank instead of being discarded before lunch. I stood slowly. My knees didn't shake. I'm still proud of that. Angela from HR approached carefully near the doorway holding a severance folder against her chest, while a security guard waited several feet behind her pretending not to listen. Marcus, former Marine, Kvietman, always held elevators when my arms were overloaded with files. Today he couldn't look at me either. As I stepped toward the exit, my eyes drifted briefly toward Melissa. And that's when I noticed it. My operational access badge sitting beside her laptop. Already reassigned. The decision hadn't happened this morning. They had been replacing me for weeks. Maybe months. And standing there inside Conference Hall B while 80 employees pretended not to stare at me, I realized something terrifying. Gregory Hale didn't fire me because I failed. He fired me because too many important people trusted me more than they trusted Blackstone itself. The hallway outside Conference Hall B felt colder than usual. Not physically. Emotionally. The kind of cold that settles over executive floors after people witness something cruel and decide silence is safer than decency. Angela Brooks walked beside me holding the severance folder, while Marcus followed several steps behind us toward the elevators. Nobody said anything at first. What exactly do you say to a woman who just lost 19 years of her life in under 5 minutes? The elevator doors opened softly. I stepped inside carrying the cardboard box HR handed me near the conference room entrance. Small box. Cheap cardboard. Barely large enough to hold 2 decades of sacrifice. Funny how corporations reduce people so efficiently once leadership decides they're inconvenient. Angela cleared her throat carefully. I know this must feel sudden. Sudden. Interesting word. The announcement may have been sudden. The betrayal wasn't. Now that I saw the pattern clearly, dozens of strange moments from the past 2 months suddenly made sense. Melissa joining executive calls unexpectedly. Private meetings moved without notifying me. IT requesting backup access to my systems. Gregory asking unusual questions about client communication structures. They had been preparing my replacement long before they eliminated my position publicly. The elevator reached the executive office floor. When the doors opened, my stomach tightened immediately. Melissa was sitting inside my office. My office. My family photo had already been removed from the bookshelf. The orchid plant near the window was gone. Even my leadership award from 2018 had disappeared from the wall. They erased me before telling me I no longer worked there. Efficient. Clean. Corporate. And standing there in the doorway watching another woman settle into the career I spent 19 years building, I realized something Gregory Hale still didn't understand. People like me were never the decoration inside companies. We were the infrastructure. Melissa froze the moment she saw me standing in the doorway. For a second, real panic crossed her face. Not guilt. Fear. Because she knew I wasn't supposed to see this part yet. Oh God, she whispered quickly, standing up from behind my desk. I thought HR would bring you later. Interesting wording. Not. I'm sorry. Not. I didn't know. Just surprised about timing. Meaning she already knew everything. Angela shifted awkwardly beside me. Even Marcus looked uncomfortable standing near the hallway. Entrance pretending not to listen. Melissa grabbed her tablet too quickly, nearly dropping it against the desk before rushing toward the door. But as she passed me, she hesitated. Only briefly. I've always respected what you built here, she said quietly. Built. Past tense. Then she disappeared down the hallway in heels that clicked too fast against the marble floors. I stepped slowly into the office. Or what used to be my office. 19 years. 19 years of missed holidays, emergency client calls, and 14-hour workdays compressed into one corner office overlooking downtown Chicago. And somehow it already looked like I had never been there. The shelves felt emptier. The walls looked colder. Even the air smelled different. Angela handed me the cardboard box carefully. We can arrange shipment for remaining personal items. Remaining. As though an entire career could be categorized like office supplies. I opened the center desk drawer instinctively. Empty. Someone had already cleaned it out. Then my eyes landed on an open notebook beside Melissa's laptop. Handwritten notes covered the page. Client transition strategy. Executive continuity plan. Sandra dependency issue. I stared at those 3 words for several seconds. Dependency issue. That's what Gregory thought I was. Not leadership. Not loyalty. Problem. And standing there inside my half-erased office while snow drifted quietly beyond the windows, something cold settled deeply inside my chest for the first time since the firing. Clarity. Because Gregory Hale didn't remove me because I failed operationally. He removed me because too many clients trusted me more than they trusted the company itself. The drive home felt unreal. Chicago traffic crawled beneath gray February skies while the cardboard box sat in the passenger seat beside me like evidence from someone else's collapse. 19 years reduced to a box holding framed photos, 2 notebooks, an orchid plant, and a coffee mug from Blackstone's 2017 leadership retreat. Funny what corporations decide people are worth carrying out the door. I stopped at a red light near Lakeshore Drive and stared at my reflection in the windshield. 49 years old. Senior Operations Director. Fired before noon. And somehow I still looked composed. That almost made it worse. Because women like me learn very early inside corporate America that composure becomes survival. You cry later. Alone. Never inside the building. My phone buzzed against the center console. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Then it rang again. Sandra Mitchell. I answered quietly through the speakers. A pause. Then, it's Daniel Reeves. Compliance. Of course. His voice sounded tight. Controlled but tight. You probably shouldn't be calling me, I said carefully. You're probably right. Silence settled briefly between us while traffic crept forward outside. Then Daniel lowered his voice further. Gregory moved your client transition earlier than scheduled. My grip tightened slightly around the steering wheel. What does that mean? It means Melissa already contacted several legacy accounts. Legacy accounts. The oldest clients. The accounts I spent years stabilizing during crises Gregory barely understood operationally. A cold feeling settled deeper into my chest. Too fast. Everything was moving too fast. Daniel exhaled softly. And Sandra, people internally are nervous. Nervous. Not optimistic. Not excited. Nervous. That word mattered. Because companies only become nervous when leadership starts losing control behind closed doors. And driving home beneath dark Chicago skies with my career sitting inside a cardboard box beside me, I realized something deeply unsettling. Blackstone wasn't simply replacing me. It was trying to contain something. I pulled into my driveway just after 6:30. The house looked exactly the same as it had that morning. White shutters. Small front porch light still glowing because I forgot to turn it off before work. Normal. Completely normal. That was the strangest part. The world outside Blackstone kept moving like my entire life hadn't just collapsed before lunch. I carried the cardboard box inside slowly and placed it on the kitchen counter. The house was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator. No conference calls. No emergency emails. No executives demanding updates every 6 minutes. Just silence. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, nobody at Blackstone needed me. At least that's what Gregory believed. I loosened my coat and opened the severance folder Angela gave me downstairs. 34 pages. Compensation terms. Healthcare continuation.
Non-disclosure agreements.
Corporate language carefully designed to sound respectful, while protecting the company from fallout. Then I reached page 12. My eyes narrowed immediately. Post-employment communication restrictions. Interesting. Blackstone wasn't just restricting confidential information. They were restricting client contact specifically. 18 months. 18 months without direct communication with several legacy accounts. My heartbeat slowed slightly. That always happened during crisis moments. Not panic. Focus. Cold, uncomfortable focus. Because suddenly Melissa's notebook from earlier replayed clearly inside my mind. Sandra dependency issue. This wasn't standard restructuring paperwork. This was containment. Gregory wasn't afraid of what I knew. He was afraid of who trusted me. My phone buzzed again before I could think further. Richard Nolan, CEO of Meridian Logistics, one of Blackstone's oldest accounts. I stared at his name in disbelief. Richard almost never called directly unless something serious was happening. I answered immediately. "Sandra," he said without greeting. "Why did Gregory call me at 5:30 this morning asking for early renewal confirmation?" There it was. The first crack. And suddenly, sitting alone in my silent kitchen, I realized Blackstone's problem had already started spreading beyond the building. Richard stayed quiet for a moment after asking the question. That silence mattered. Executives only pause like that when they're trying to measure how serious a situation really is. I walked slowly toward the kitchen window while snow drifted softly across the backyard outside. What exactly did Gregory say? I asked carefully. Richard exhaled sharply through the phone. He wanted reassurance Meridian wasn't reconsidering operational partnerships after your departure. There it was. Not concern about me personally. Fear about fallout. My eyes moved toward the severance folder still lying open across the kitchen table. Page 12 remained visible beneath the overhead light. Protected legacy accounts. Sandra dependency issue. Everything was starting to connect now. Richard lowered his voice slightly. "Sandra, what's happening inside Blackstone? Interesting. Not, why were you fired? Not, what did you do? What's happening inside Blackstone?" Because experienced executives understand something most employees don't. Stable companies do not publicly remove senior leadership without preparing the industry first. And Gregory clearly failed to do that. "I honestly don't know yet," I admitted carefully. That part was true. But deep down, my instincts were already telling me something larger was happening beneath the restructuring language. Richard sighed quietly. "Well, several firms are nervous. Several firms." My expression hardened slightly. It had already spread. Not publicly. Privately. Which was worse. Because industries rarely destroy companies through dramatic announcements. They isolate them quietly through conversations behind closed doors. Richard continued carefully. "Melissa tried scheduling a transition call this afternoon. And I canceled it. That got my attention immediately." "Why?" Another brief silence. Then, "Because nobody trusts rushed transitions during executive instability." Executive instability. Professional wording. Corporate wording. But translated honestly, something feels wrong at Blackstone. I leaned against the kitchen counter while the refrigerator hummed softly behind me. 3 days ago I thought I was mourning a career. Now sitting alone in my silent house while one of Blackstone's biggest clients questioned leadership stability directly, I realized something far more dangerous. Gregory Hale didn't just fire me publicly. He accidentally exposed how dependent the company had become on trust he never truly understood. By Friday morning, the atmosphere around Blackstone had changed completely. You could feel it in the emails. The wording. The hesitation. Executives who normally took 2 days to respond suddenly answered within minutes. Vendors started asking unusual questions about continuity planning. Clients requested private calls instead of group meetings. Fear changes communication patterns very quickly inside corporate America. And after 19 years in operations leadership, I recognized the signs immediately. My laptop chimed again while I sat at the dining room table staring at untouched coffee. Another anonymous internal message. Board meeting moved up. Investors asking questions. No signature. Still no signature. Someone inside Blackstone was feeding me information now. That mattered. Employees only leak information once they stop believing leadership can protect the company. My phone rang before I could think further. Melissa Carter. I almost ignored it. Almost. Her voice sounded tighter than usual the moment I answered. "Sandra, have you spoken with Meridian recently?" Direct question. No small talk. "Interesting. Why would you ask that?" I replied calmly. A brief silence followed. Then, "They postponed the transition meeting." There it was. The first visible fracture. I leaned back slowly in the chair while morning light reflected across the kitchen windows. "How many accounts are nervous right now, Melissa?" Too much silence. Then quietly, 3 major ones. 3. In less than a week. My expression never changed, but something inside me sharpened immediately. This wasn't revenge. That part mattered.
Primeant contacta clients strategically.
Hadn't exposed company secrets. Hadn't encouraged anyone to leave. Blackstone was destabilizing itself trying to explain why trust disappeared with me. Melissa exhaled softly. Gregory thinks someone is damaging relationships intentionally. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was predictable. Executives who underestimate quiet people always assume sabotage once consequences appear. No one's damaging anything, I said calmly. And deep down I knew that was the truth. Blackstone wasn't collapsing because I fought back. It was collapsing because Gregory Hale publicly revealed how fragile the company already was underneath me. By Monday afternoon, Blackstone stopped pretending the situation was temporary. That was the first real shift. The emails became shorter, more urgent. Executives who once sounded polished suddenly sounded tired. Fear does that to people, especially powerful people who realize control is slipping faster than they expected. Rain streaked softly across my office windows while I reviewed another wave of messages from former clients asking careful, indirect questions. Nobody wanted gossip. They wanted reassurance. And the terrifying part for Blackstone? I could no longer give it honestly. My laptop chimed again. Another anonymous internal message. CFO meeting with board tonight. Recruiting firms pausing partnerships. I stared at the screen quietly. Recruiting firms. That was bad. Very bad. Because recruiters hear instability before investors do. My phone buzzed almost immediately afterward.
Gregory Hale.
First direct call since the firing. I answered calmly. His voice sounded different this time. Still controlled. Still executive polished. But underneath, exhaustion. Sandra, he said carefully, we need to discuss several ongoing relationships. Need. Not want. Need. Interesting difference. I leaned back slowly in my chair. What exactly do you need from me, Gregory? A small silence followed. Then finally, Meridian suspended renewal discussions this morning. There it was. Official now. Not whispers. Not concern. Action. Outside, rain tapped steadily against the windows while downtown Chicago disappeared beneath gray afternoon clouds. Meanwhile, Blackstone Strategic Solutions, the same company that publicly escorted me out with security 4 days earlier, was quietly losing control of its largest accounts. Gregory lowered his voice. The board is concerned this situation is becoming reputational. Reputational. Corporate language again. Translated honestly, the industry is backing away from us. I closed my eyes briefly. Not out of satisfaction. Out of clarity. Because Gregory still didn't understand the real problem. This was never about Sandra Mitchell leaving Blackstone. It was about Blackstone publicly proving how little they understood the relationships holding the company together. And once industries lose trust and leadership judgment, recovery becomes almost impossible. Gregory spoke again. Quieter this time. I didn't realize how many people stayed because of you. For a second, neither of us said anything. Then I looked out across the rain-covered city, and finally understood something that took me 19 years to learn. Companies rarely notice invisible loyalty until the person carrying it disappears. 2 weeks after my firing, Blackstone no longer looked stable from the outside. That mattered more than Gregory realized. Because companies survive financial pressure all the time. What they rarely survive is loss of confidence. And confidence inside corporate America spreads through perception faster than facts. I heard it in Daniel's voice first. The executive floor feels different, he admitted quietly over the phone Tuesday evening. Rain tapped softly against my living room windows while I sat curled beneath a blanket for the first peaceful evening I'd had in years. No conference calls. No emergency meetings.
No executives demanding impossible timelines.
Just silence. Strange how humiliation can sometimes become freedom in disguise. What kind of different? I asked. Daniel exhaled slowly. People are updating resumes during lunch. There it was. The real collapse signal. Not investor panic. Employee escape. Because once senior staff begin preparing exits quietly, trust inside leadership disappears almost overnight. My laptop chimed on the coffee table beside me. Another internal announcement from Blackstone. Chief Financial Officer resignation effective immediately. I stared at the email silently. The CFO leaving during instability was catastrophic optics. Not publicly catastrophic yet, but internally, devastating. People only abandon executive positions quickly when they believe conditions ahead are getting worse. Daniel lowered his voice. And Melissa resigned this afternoon. That surprised me. Not because I thought she was loyal. Because ambitious people usually stay until collapse becomes visible publicly. What happened? I asked quietly. She broke down during a client call. Silence settled between us. Then Daniel added. One of the accounts asked whether you were coming back. I closed my eyes briefly. Poor Melissa. Gregory positioned her as the future of leadership without realizing he was handing her responsibilities built on trust she hadn't earned yet. That's the problem with executives who only understand titles. They mistake authority for loyalty. Outside, headlights reflected across rain-soaked pavement, while downtown Chicago disappeared beneath dark evening clouds. And somewhere inside Blackstone's tower, people were probably whispering around coffee machines wondering who would leave next. Because once fear replaces confidence inside a company, collapse becomes only a matter of time. 3 weeks after Gregory Hale fired me in front of 80 employees, Blackstone finally stopped trying to contain the damage quietly. Because by then, quiet containment wasn't working anymore. Too many accounts were nervous. Too many vendors were hesitating. Too many recruiters had started distancing themselves from the company. And industries notice patterns long before the public ever sees collapse headlines. I was sitting in my home office reviewing consulting paperwork when my phone rang again. Angela Brooks, HR. Her voice sounded exhausted before she even spoke. Sandra, the board hired outside consultants. Consultants? Interesting. Corporations only bring in outside firms once internal leadership stops trusting itself. What are they reviewing? I asked calmly. A brief silence followed. Then, operational dependency risks. There it was again. Dependency. The same word Melissa wrote inside that notebook sitting on my desk the morning they erased me. Sandra dependency issue. Except now Blackstone finally understood the real problem wasn't dependence on me personally. It was dependence on invisible trust leadership never respected properly. Rain rolled softly against the windows while Angela continued carefully. The consultants believed too much client stability was centralized around specific executives. Specific executives. Corporate wording desperately trying not to say my name directly. I leaned back slowly in the chair. And what conclusion are they reaching? Angela hesitated. Then quietly. That Blackstone built major relationships around people leadership treated as replaceable. For a second, neither of us spoke. Because that was the truth no executive wanted written officially inside a consulting report. Not financial failure. Not operational failure. Leadership failure. Gregory spent years believing branding created loyalty. But clients weren't loyal to Blackstone's logo. They were loyal to the people who solved problems quietly at 2 a.m. when systems failed and investors panicked. People like me. Outside, downtown Chicago disappeared beneath another gray evening, while my orchid plant sat healthier near the office window than it ever looked inside Blackstone. Funny. Even plants recover once removed from toxic environments. Angela lowered her voice again. There's pressure for Gregory to resign. That surprised me less than it should have. Because once boards begin hiring consultants to study executive dependency failures, leadership collapse usually follows soon after. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like everything else in corporate America. I stared out across the rain-covered neighborhood while silence settled softly through the room. 3 weeks earlier I walked out of Blackstone carrying a cardboard box wondering whether my career was over. Now the same executives who erased me were hiring consultants to explain why the company started collapsing after I disappeared. And deep down I finally understood something women like me learn far too late. Invisible labor only becomes visible once it's gone. A month after my firing, Blackstone Strategic Solutions officially withdrew from the Midwest Leadership Summit. That announcement spread through executive circles faster than Gregory probably expected. Because Blackstone never missed industry events. Not once in nearly 15 years. They sponsored panels. Hosted investor dinners. branded themselves as one of Chicago's most stable consulting firms. And suddenly they disappeared from the attendee list entirely.
No explanation.
No press release. Just absence. In corporate America, absence speaks loudly. I learned about it from Richard Nolan during lunch downtown. The restaurant overlooked the river. Gray winter light reflecting across the water while executives filled nearby tables pretending not to overhear one another's conversations. Richard stirred his coffee slowly. People are calling it an internal confidence crisis now. Confidence crisis. Interesting wording. Much cleaner than saying leadership lost control of the company. I sat back quietly while waiters moved through the crowded restaurant carrying trays of expensive lunches executives barely tasted during stressful weeks like this. How bad is it internally? I asked. Richard hesitated. Then, 7 senior departures in under a month. 7. Not layoffs. Executives leaving voluntarily. That mattered more. Because people close to leadership always see collapse first. My phone buzzed softly beside the water glass. Daniel. One short message. Gregory resigned this morning. I stared at the screen for several seconds without speaking. Not shock. Just stillness. Because deep down I think part of me always knew this story would end there eventually. Richard watched my expression carefully. What happened? I turned the phone toward him silently. He exhaled under his breath. Wow. Outside, snow drifted slowly beyond the restaurant windows while downtown Chicago continued moving beneath gray skies like nothing extraordinary had happened. But something extraordinary had happened. One executive decision. One public humiliation. And suddenly an entire leadership structure collapsed underneath the weight of trust it never appreciated properly. Richard lowered his voice slightly. You know they're blaming the firing now. Of course they were. That's how corporations survive disasters. They isolate mistakes into single moments instead of admitting the culture underneath those moments created the collapse long before anyone noticed. I looked down at my untouched coffee. They didn't collapse because they fired me, I said quietly. Richard frowned slightly. Then why did they collapse? I thought about Melissa crying during client calls. Daniel whispering updates from inside the building. Employees secretly leaking information because they stopped trusting leadership. Gregory sitting alone behind glass walls trying desperately to stabilize relationships he never personally built. Then I answered honestly. Because they believed loyalty was automatic. Silence settled between us for a moment. Heavy silence. Real silence. The kind people only sit in when they recognize an uncomfortable truth inside their own careers too. And walking back through downtown Chicago afterward with cold wind cutting between skyscrapers, I realized something strangely peaceful. For 19 years I thought Blackstone gave my life meaning. Now the company barely existed in the form I sacrificed myself for. But I was still here. Still standing. Still rebuilding. And for the first time in decades, my future finally belonged to me instead of a corporation pretending loyalty only mattered one direction. 3 months later, I returned to downtown Chicago for the Midwest Leadership Summit wearing the same navy blazer I wore the morning Gregory Hale fired me in front of 80 employees. Only this time, nobody looked away when I entered the room. Executives crossed the ballroom to shake my hand before I even reached the registration table. Former clients smiled warmly. Recruiters handed me business cards carefully, like they suddenly understood something they missed before. Respect feels very different once it's no longer attached to a corporation. The ballroom lights reflected softly across tall glass windows overlooking the city skyline, while quiet conversations filled the room around me. And for the first time in nearly 20 years, I wasn't representing Blackstone Strategic Solutions. I was simply Sandra Mitchell. Free. Richard Nolan approached beside the window holding 2 glasses of sparkling water. You know half this industry blames Gregory for destroying Blackstone, he said quietly. I looked across the ballroom.
No Blackstone sponsorship banners.
No executive panel.
No Gregoriale.
Just absence. That's how industries punish companies quietly. Not through scandals. Through exclusion. Richard handed me a folder. My new consulting agreements. For clients already signed. 2 more pending review. 3 months earlier I walked out of Blackstone carrying a cardboard box wondering whether my life was over. Now I own my own firm. Funny how quickly. Humiliation can transform into freedom once fear disappears. A younger woman approached me nervously near the end of the evening, probably early 30s, exhausted eyes, corporate posture. The kind of woman who apologizes before speaking during meetings filled with louder men. "I just wanted to thank you," she said softly. "For what?" She smiled weakly. "For proving companies don't get to decide someone's worth after using them for years." That stayed with me long after she walked away, because she understood something I wish I learned much earlier. Corporations will gladly accept your loyalty, your weekends, your health, your silence, your entire identity, and then one morning they'll call it restructuring while security walks you toward the elevator carrying a cardboard box. Not because you lost value, because leadership convinced itself your loyalty would survive disrespect indefinitely. Sometimes they're wrong. Very wrong. I stood near the ballroom windows watching snow fall softly across downtown Chicago, while the city lights blurred against the glass. 3 months ago I thought Gregory Hale destroyed my career publicly. Now I understand he accidentally gave me my life back. And if there's one thing I hope you remember from my story, it's this: never build your entire identity around a company that would replace you before your desk gets cold. Because loyalty without respect eventually becomes self-destruction. Blackstone needed me far more than they ever appreciated. They just realized it too late.